Over 1,000 years ago, the sun-washed land of southern Spain was home to Jews, Christians, and Muslims living together and flourishing. Their culture and beliefs intertwined, and the knowledge of the ancients was gathered and reborn. Here were the very seeds of the Renaissance. But this world too quickly vanished. Greed, fear, and intolerance swept it away. Puritanical judgments and absolutism snuffed out the light of learning. Within a few centuries, the fragile union of these people dissipated like smoke. The time of tolerance was lost forever.
The western lands of the Roman Empire, what we now call France, Germany, Spain, Portugal, England, those regions collapsed first. They were abandoned by Roman legions first.
And with the empire's decline, Europe enters a new age.
Historians don't like to use any longer the phrase Dark Ages. But truth be told, there was a lot that was dark about this time. The Roman Empire collapses. There's not as much trade. Many libraries are pillaged and wrecked, and some of the great classics disappear.
Poetry and science, medicine and mathematics, the great knowledge of the Romans and Greeks is lost. In the wake of this violence, the barbarian tribes are still left homeless. They migrate across Europe, searching the Roman provinces for a land of their own. The migrations bring a great movement and mixture of cultures into the remains of the broken empire. In 476, the Visigoth tribes reach westward to the isolated Roman peninsula of Iberia, what we now call Spain and Portugal. And there, they find Jews living in many of its cities, such as Cordoba, Granada, and Toledo.
The Jews of Visigothic Spain weren't in the best or the strongest position, in a sense that they were a marginalized minority within a culture which didn't necessarily understand Jewish practices or Jewish religion.
In the late 6th century, this growing religious tension erupts in violence as the Visigoths convert to Catholicism and begin to actively persecute the Jews of Spain.
Most of the evidence that we have comes from a series of law codes which were promulgated by Visigothic kings and which typically restricted the action of Jews, forced them to convert, and ultimately enslaved them.
And one great theologian at the time compares Judaism to a kind of cancer that has to get cut out before it spreads to the rest of the body, the Christian body.
As these two faiths struggle, one for survival, one for dominance, a third Abrahamic religion is born, over 4,500 miles away, in an ancient city called Mecca. The new faith of Islam unites the tribes of Arabia and begins an astonishing wave of conquest across the Middle East, eventually establishing its capital in Damascus, Syria, before it spreads into North Africa.
So in that sense, we should think of the Muslims, in some way, as a migratory wave just like the Visigoths, except 200 years later.
The Islamic Empire holds most of the peninsula by 732. They call their new land Al-Andalus. In the following decades, the marketplaces of Al-Andalus reflect a turbulent melting pot of cultures and allegiances. The Berber and Arab settlers must share their new land with its Christian and Jewish people.
One of the things that happens with the Islamic conquests is that the Muslims conquer large areas with very large populations that are, of course, not Muslim. But there's a lot that's attractive about Islam to the populations they conquer.
Under Islamic law, Christians and Jews are given the status of dhimmi, meaning protected people in Arabic.
Muslims believed, and this goes back to the Quran, that members of religions of the book, the same scriptures, should be respected, which is to say they should be allowed to follow their religions.
Once the dynasty had arrived and conquered the Christian enemy, it quickly began to splinter. You know, and there were Arab factions and there were Berber North African factions.
The Berbers, long treated as lower-class citizens, begin to revolt against the Arab aristocracy. In the chaos that follows, a figure appears. A fugitive prince, fleeing the bloody coup of his royal family back in the Islamic capital of Damascus. His name is Abdul Rahman.
This is a real story of someone who's really literally swimming and running for their life. After many adventures, he managed to make his way from Syria to Egypt to North Africa. His mother was North African, so he had family connections there. And finally, he crossed over to Al-Andalus.
Abdul Rahman unites the populace against their corrupt governor, Yusuf, at the Battle of Guadalquivir.
When Abdul Rahman I arrived in Al-Andalus, the governor and all of the people who were in power there at the time weren't particularly happy to see him, because they perceived him not as a liberator, but as a threat to their own power. He directly challenged their authority, and what he did was systematically destroy them.
Victorious, Abdul Rahman declares himself emir, or leader, and makes the nearby Cordoba the capital of his new kingdom. Abdul Rahman's reign begins a new dynasty that will forever shape the future of Al-Andalus.
His dynasty brings to Spain a consolidated rule that lasts for centuries. And part of the reason why Spain prospers is exactly because, one, there's this consolidated rule, there's one authority, and also because there are these links back to the glories of Islamic civilization in other lands.
Over the next century, Cordoba's own glory continues to grow, as not only Muslims, but also Christians and Jews begin to develop an integrated culture that is unique to Al-Andalus.
And you get many, many people who start to speak Arabic, but don't become Muslim. You'll have Christians who remain Christian under Islam, but take Arabic as their language.
The Jews and Christians, especially the Jews, are pretty well integrated into the economic life and into social life. They do business with Muslims and they interact with Muslims. So space is made for them.
Key to this was the openness of that society. Because the emirs, because the political elite in Al-Andalus did not feel threatened by their minorities. They didn't feel threatened by the Christians. They didn't feel threatened by the Jews. They were accommodating.
This thriving culture draws attention. Al-Andalus, once a mere outpost in the larger Islamic empire, becomes a lively center of trade. Viking ships from the North Sea, as well as merchants from the new Islamic capital of Baghdad, bring an influx of goods and of people to Cordoba. Abdul Rahman III proclaims Al-Andalus independence from the rest of the Islamic Empire in 929. He names Cordoba the capital of his caliphate, calling himself Caliph, the legitimate successor of the Prophet Muhammad.
Abdul Rahman III was the first Caliph who declared himself openly to be the legitimate authority in all of the Islamic world. So this is a period of supreme confidence for Al-Andalus.
It was precisely that claim to authority that allowed him to then build a program of monumental buildings, of infrastructure improvements, and usher in an era of enormous economic expansion.
At his palace, Abdul Rahman III not only accepts ambassadors from far-off lands, he also employs his own, both Christian and Jewish, to travel abroad.
If we look at the court of Abdul Rahman III, it reflects, in many ways, all of these trends of diversity that had been developing in Al-Andalus up to that time.
In 955, he sends his secretary, the Christian Rahman of Granada, as his diplomatic emissary to Otto I, the King of Germany. Because Rahman is a Christian, he is able to connect with the German king, settling a potentially volatile dispute, and establish a treaty between Al-Andalus and Germany.
These poems reflect a kind of cultural sharing, if you will. They set up this kinds of cross-religious, cross-cultural dialogue.
Poetry served the exact same function as PR and newspapers today. You circulated opinions by poetry because people liked catchy phrases. They would memorize it, they would circulate it.
We're talking about a library that would hold volumes on just about every subject imaginable. You have books on astronomy. You had books on astrology. You also had many books on science, on natural sciences.
With this new scientific knowledge, agriculture booms. Cordoba blossoms like never before during what's called the Green Revolution. Sadly, in 976, darkness falls on Al-Andalus as the death of Abdul Rahman III's successor begins a period of hostility and upheaval.
It was a time of great upheaval when native Spanish Muslims turned against Berbers, when Jews and Christians became more vulnerable. It was, and really the best expression for this is an Arabic one, it was the time of fitna, of strife.
By the beginning of the 11th century, the unified Al-Andalus has enjoyed a cultural efflorescence. But without the authority of its great leader, Caliph Abdul Rahman III, Al-Andalus now begins to break apart, dividing into separate, smaller kingdoms called taifas. But they also contribute to a growing demand among many Muslim and Christian leaders for a purification of their religion and of their land. In Rome, Pope Alexander II sees the intimate relationships between Christians and Muslims as immoral, and he seeks to purify Spain of all Muslims.
In the core of Christendom, they saw the kinds of relationships that Christians had with Muslims in Spain as a source of contamination, as a possibility of error, as a kind of traffic with the enemy.
This crusading movement, of course, affects the mentality in Spain. So the Crusades bring, for example, a harshening of the rhetoric on the Christian side, and conversely, on the Muslim side, we're getting these more puritanical dynasties from North Africa launching jihads into southern Spain to kind of shore up their beleaguered co-religionists.
Appeals to absolutes on both sides led to hardening of positions, led to great strife within those governments, and then you see a kind of a downward slide.
1207, the Pope proclaims Spain a crusading zone and calls upon other European armies to join forces.
It was not only the Christians in Iberia that were fighting the Almohads. It was some sort of crusade. People had come from France, from Germany. All the crusaders came to defeat the Muslims, especially after the crusades failed in the East.
They march not only for conquest, but for what they believe God wants, a purely Christian Spain.
So this becomes Spain's crusade. And one of the popes, in fact, instructs Spanish knights that they shouldn't go off on these voyages to the Holy Land, that their job is to liberate their own country for Christendom.
In 1236, the Christian armies conquer the once magnificent city of Cordoba, the very seat of Al-Andalusian scholarship and innovation. The Muslims can do nothing to stop the Christian conquest.
It was symbolic because they knew that the end was coming. And when the Christians took it, they knew that they could not count on anyone to come and help them. It was hopeless.
In an act of utter domination, the Christian king orders the great mosque consecrated as a Catholic church, which in the 16th century will be expanded into an elaborate cathedral. Many come from Seville when the Christian army brutally takes the city in 1248. All Muslims are forced to leave, taking only what they can carry in their arms.
The Christian kingdoms were expanding. Castile was pushing southward, taking over really the choicest areas of Al-Andalus. Seville, the Guadalquivir, this very rich, wealthy area of the south was falling.
It gradually changed. As Spain became Christianized, Christians were able to take over, thank you very much. They now acquired the skills, and the skills that the Jews had became less important.
As the 13th century continues, the Christian public sentiment turns against the Jews of Spain. The Christian territories on the peninsula are now established and secure. In 1252, Alfonso X is crowned King of Castile and Leon, now the largest Christian kingdom on the peninsula. Conditions are becoming increasingly difficult for both Muslims and Jews, as Alfonso X sets out to establish a master code of laws for his diverse populace.
We begin to see a diminution in the status of Jewish courtiers, a tendency on the part of the ruler to confiscate Jewish property, to settle political problems by simply throwing all the Jewish leadership in jail.
Alfonso X's Christian subjects call for severe punishments, such as public lashing for Jews who do not wear identifying clothing. At times, the punishments are even more brutal.
In his law codes, Alfonso says that where someone is so unfortunate as to convert to Judaism or Islam, we order that they be put to death.
Alhambra and the Kingdom of Granada at the time reflected Islam when it was open to influences, open to interaction with other cultures, whether it is Christian, Jewish, or whatever, and European too. That before Islam basically fell back on itself and closed doors and said, we don't want to deal with the rest of the world. So Alhambra is a very good example of what happens when people open up.
The Granadan artists and craftsmen are known for their incomparable skill, even among the Christian kings.
They're inviting, for example, Muslims to come build their palaces for them, to transform them for them. They don't want Christian workmen, they want the best workmen available.
The Christian King Pedro I of Castile hires Muslim craftsmen from Granada when he wants to remodel his expansive palace, the Alcazar in Seville.
On the facade, as you enter into the Alcazar of Seville, you see a sort of polylobed arches and inscriptions that are both Latin and also Arabic. And also one sees in the small detail, one sees shields, the shields of Castile.
The entire Christian palace embodies the culture of Al-Andalus, seen in every courtyard and every carved wall.
The kings of Castile didn't change it into a cold, dark Christian kind of castle. They changed their own lifestyle so that they began to live more and more like their Muslim neighbors. So religion was no barrier to adopting a luxurious lifestyle.
And the Kingdom of Granada enjoys relative peace and prosperity even after the plague subsides in Europe. In that last vestige of Al-Andalus, Muslims and Jews live together and thrive.
Granada was a really diverse community. They were eating the same food, they were wearing the same kind of clothes, they were probably singing the same songs, speaking the same languages. I mean, it's really one culture.
While its people hold strong to the ancestral culture of Al-Andalus, Granada remains safe in its sheltered valley. By the 15th century, Granada has not only survived the Christian conquest of Spain, but flourished, creating extraordinary architecture and poetry in a time of plague and warfare. But even the magnificent kingdom of Granada will be lost as the forces of conquest and purification intensify. Queen Isabel and King Ferdinand are joined in a lavish ceremony outside Toledo.
So the two largest regions, they come together in marriage, and they are now united to campaign against that last holdout in the south.
For Isabel and Ferdinand, their conquest is not only of land, but of religion, with devastating consequences for the Muslims and Jews of Spain. With a strong Catholic monarchy ruling over Christian Spain, the Pope authorizes the Spanish Inquisition, a bloody investigation into the private religious lives of their people.
Originally, the Inquisition was meant to deal with Christians who were lapsed, not with Jews or with Muslims. But over time, it began to concern itself with converted Jews who had lapsed back to Judaism. And then, of course, once we have masses of Muslims who have converted to Christianity, it began to concern itself with converted Muslims, we call them Moriscos, who had lapsed back into Islam.
Queen Isabel names the priest Tomás de Torquemada as the Inquisitor General. A 15th century Christian chronicler describes Torquemada as the hammer of heretics, the light of Spain, the savior of his country, the honor of his order. Torquemada is to try and to punish those who have converted to Christianity but continue to practice their own faiths. With the alliance broken, Ferdinand launches a siege on the walled city of Granada, and in January of 1492, Spain's last Muslim city finally succumbs to the Christian army. In the centuries following the fall of Granada, Muslims are given the same choice as the Jews in 1492: convert to Christianity or leave Spain. Some converted Muslims, called Moriscos, continue to worship in secret, trying desperately to hold on to their traditions.
During the 16th century, there were Muslims in Spain, kind of cut off from the rest of the Islamic world and leading a vestigial Islamic life.
So the Muslims not only have the symbolic loss of what was this jewel in their worldwide civilization, they have this added sadness and indignity that their religion is taken from them.
Finally, in 1609, the last of the Moriscos, over 500,000 in number, are expelled from Spain, even though they have converted to Christianity.
Just think of what medieval Spain gave to Europe. We have this technology for making paper. We have this irrigation technology. We have these medical ideas. And all of these things came about only because cultures interacted and borrowed from each other.